Hello everyone. So the channel Economics Explained just released a video about why Africa is poor, and said some very, very wrong things about African history. I don't usually make response videos, but after the reply I started typing got to be more than a few paragraphs, I realized that tossing it into a comment section where barely anyone would ever read it would be a waste. So here we are. I want to be clear, this video isn't an attack on Economics Explained. These are really, really big mistakes, but they're unfortunately not that uncommon. This isn't even the first time I've seen them from a popular YouTube channel. I think seeing this sort of stuff from mainstream, popular channels indicates something about just how widespread certain wildly inaccurate ideas about African history are in the public consciousness. So the purpose of this response is more to use this Economics Explained video as a jumping off point to set the record straight on some common misconceptions about some of the fundamentals of African history. With that in mind, let's get into what the Economics Explained video actually says and how far it is from the reality. Let's start with their claims about Africa's relationship to the rest of the Old World.
The most obvious place to start is simply how isolated most of the continent has been. The Sahara Desert divides the continent east to west, and for most of human history has effectively acted as a large ocean, making most of the land to the south an island, physically separated from a lot of the societal developments that took place along the trading routes between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia.
The claim that the Sahara cut Sub-Saharan Africa off from the rest of the Old World is just completely laughable if you know anything about Sahelian history. The Sahara was less like an ocean, rendering Sub-Saharan Africa an island, and more like a sea, a la the Mediterranean, rendering Sub-Saharan Africa an opposite coast, with oases acting like islands in between. Arab traders even explicitly conceptualized the Sahara as a sort of sea, referring to the southern edge where the desert transitioned into habitable grassland as the Sahel, meaning coast. Just as Europeans, West Asians, and North Africans started regularly crossing the Mediterranean to exchange goods and culture from as soon as they acquired ships capable of doing so, North Africans and Sahelians regularly crossed the Sahara to do the same from the 3rd century CE, when camels were introduced to the region. The degree of Trans-Saharan trade prior to this point is a matter of some debate due to limited archaeological evidence, but rock art from the southern Sahara featuring horses, Roman-era West African artifacts made from copper tracing back to the Mediterranean, and ancient Egyptian accounts of travel between Egypt and the southern Saharan land of Yam all demonstrate that such trade occurred to some degree. Timbuktu in modern-day Mali became an intellectual hub for much of the Islamic world throughout much of the Middle Ages, with many scholars from different regions traveling there to study. And on the flip side, we also have a fair few records of Sahelian and Senegambian people traveling to North Africa and Islamic Spain to study or serve as warriors. These included people from the kingdom of Takrur in Senegambia, who are also recorded traveling through Egypt on pilgrimage to Mecca in 1484 CE, alongside pilgrims from Bornu, a Chadian empire whose borders themselves stretched across much of the Sahara to include the southern Libyan oasis town of Murzouk. By the 11th century, rulers and students from the Bornu Empire were regularly making pilgrimage to Mecca. They traveled through Egypt so often that by 1242 they had built their own school in Cairo and were regularly attending Al-Azhar University. During the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, when many Sephardic Jews fled to the Ottoman Empire, we also have records of a portion continuing across the Sahara to form a small population in the Bilad al-Sudan. Sahelian empires like Ouagadougou, which I have a video about on my channel, Mali, and Songhay became extremely wealthy by acting as middlemen in the trade of goods between the Sahara and further south in West Africa, particularly the salt gold trade. Trans-Saharan Contact has been continuous and extensive since the late classical period, something which only began to change in the early modern period, when coastal trade with European powers gave southern West African states a cheaper option for luxury goods than trade with the Sahel. And it doesn't stop there. Just as the Mediterranean has an eastern coast where overland trade can also occur, the Sahara has an equivalent coast in the form of the Nile Valley, where travel up and down the Nile has been extensive throughout history, providing another route for trade and interaction between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Beyond that, there's the Red Sea, which, like a mini-Mediterranean, has provided an enclosed area for trade for thousands of years. The Egyptians recorded trading with the land of Punt in the Horn of Africa as far back as 2500 BCE, and contact between southern Arabia and the Horn has been extensive since before recorded history, with heavy archaeological and linguistic evidence of these contacts, which continued through recorded history as well. Aksum in today's Ethiopia and Eritrea was one of the first two countries to adopt Christianity as the official state religion, provided refuge to the Prophet Muhammad and his earliest followers when they were pushed out of Arabia according to Islamic tradition, and performed conquests in southern Arabia as well. These were extensive contacts between Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia that completely circumvented the Sahara. Travel a bit further south and you hit the Swahili coast, which was home to polities known by the Greeks in the 1st century CE as Azania and Rapta. Already at that time, they seem to have been using the sewn boats iconic of the Indian Ocean trade, as Rapta comes from the Greek word for sewn. From that period on, this region was extensively involved in the Indian Ocean system, with pottery, porcelains, silks, cottons, and other luxury goods being imported from as far as East Asia. Swahili merchants traveled as far as South, Southeast, and East Asia, as well as engaging in plenty of trade with West Asia. Archaeological finds have further demonstrated trading links from the Swahili coast inland, with the southern African kingdom of Mapungubwe having ties to the Swahili Kilwa Sultanate, for example. Similar trading networks existed throughout Africa, just as they did everywhere else in the Old World. Now, there are some barriers within Africa that probably did slow down trade a bit, but the Sahara really isn't one of them when it could be both crossed and circumvented. The biggest actual barrier would be the Tsetse Belt, a wide region of Africa where a species of fly called the tsetse is endemic. These flies carry a parasite deadly to many large mammals that haven't evolved resistance, which prevented horses from spreading into this region or south of it until they were brought to southern Africa by ship in the colonial era. A lack of horses might have slowed trade down a bit in these parts of Africa. Additionally, heavily overlapping with the Tsetse Belt is the Forest Belt, a region of dense forests that may have obstructed travel somewhat in parts of West and Central Africa. However, people could still move around by foot, cut paths through forested areas, and travel by boat where lakes and rivers were present, so there were still plenty of trade routes through this region. But hoo boy, the idea that Africa was cut off from the rest of the Old World seems like a minor issue compared to what they say about agriculture in Africa.
Making the transition to productive agriculture is one of the most significant things humanity has ever done, but it was obviously easier to take that step where the land was more naturally fertile. The Sahara Desert clearly isn't ideal for farming, but even the most seemingly fertile lands in the centre of the continent have poor soil quality that is prone to rapid erosion unless it's carefully managed by even the most advanced modern farming techniques. An ancient civilization would have found it very hard to develop agriculture given these factors, and there was also no real incentive to. In lush areas where agriculture would have been possible, it was just easier to forage or hunt for food, rather than invest the effort into developing farms.
The video suggests that agriculture would have been hard to develop in Africa, and that there wasn't much incentive to do so in the parts of Africa best suited to it. This argument might sound really compelling if you don't know that Africa independently developed agriculture in multiple regions, with evidence of plant cultivation in modern-day Sudan, West Africa, and the Horn of Africa dating back to no later than 3000 BCE, 2500 BCE, and between 4000 and 1000 BCE, respectively. These domestication events are obviously more recent than the 9700 BCE date assigned to crop domestication in the Fertile Crescent, but they're a lot closer to the dates when agriculture first spread to the edges of Europe and Asia from starting points in the Fertile Crescent and Chinese river valleys. So the later dates really aren't good evidence of African geography producing less incentive for agriculture like the video suggests. West Africans, especially in the Niger River Basin, domesticated a wide range of crops such as pearl millet, cowpeas, African rice, yams, and okra. And East Africans domesticated sorghum, teff, and more recently coffee, which quickly spread along those previously mentioned trade routes to become a popular product in Asia and Europe. Many crops originating in Asia and Oceania also made their way to sub-Saharan Africa over the centuries and saw cultivation in different areas, from wheat, barley, and Asian rice to bananas. Animal agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa goes even further back, with many livestock species like cattle, goats, and sheep spreading south along the Nile or across the then smaller Sahara by the 6th millennium BCE, with complex cattle-rearing cultures existing at least as far south as modern-day Niger by 5200 BCE, which I'll note is several centuries before our earliest evidence of livestock rearing in northwestern Europe. Sub-Saharan Africa also saw some locally domesticated livestock, most notably the domestication of African wild asses into domestic donkeys around 3000 BCE. Yet another reminder that sub-Saharan Africa wasn't cut off from the rest of the Old World, considering how widespread donkeys became in Eurasia as well as Africa. Guinea fowl were also domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa, probably sometime before 500 BCE, though when exactly is unclear. So I think the fact that sub-Saharan Africa independently developed agriculture multiple times pretty obviously refutes the idea that there was no incentive for agriculture in Africa. But more importantly, this agriculture was widespread for most of sub-Saharan African history. Animal agriculture had spread into southern Africa from both the northwest and the northeast by around the 1st century BCE, and plant cultivation seems to have spread throughout most of Africa alongside the Bantu languages, spreading throughout much of Central Africa and into the Great Lakes region of East Africa between about 2000 and 500 BCE, to the southern edge of Central Africa and the East African coast by at least the 1st century CE, and reaching modern-day South Africa by 300 to 500 CE. Far from what Economics Explained suggests, hunter-gatherers have made up only a few small pockets of sub-Saharan Africa's population since the late classical period, nowhere near a majority. In their video, they feature some clips of the Hadza people, one of several hunter-gatherer groups who live in the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, alongside a much larger number of pastoralist populations, who are all surrounded by sedentary farming communities. Look elsewhere in Africa and you'll find a few small Central African hunter-gatherer populations, also known as pygmies, in several dozen tiny pockets of Central and East African rainforest, and the San peoples of Southern Africa, who are largely concentrated in the Kalahari Desert, where agriculture never really took off for some mysterious reason. There were also potentially hunter-gatherer populations in West Africa into the historical era, but they seem to have been completely absorbed by the early modern era. These tiny pockets of hunter-gatherers are pretty comparable to the situation in Eurasia, where you have a few hunter-gatherer populations persisting to this day in a few relatively isolated areas, often completely surrounded by agriculturalist populations. This idea of sub-Saharan Africa as having never adopted agriculture is just completely ahistorical. Imagine someone thinking Europe or Asia didn't have farming until the modern age. Thinking that Africa didn't should feel equally ridiculous. But unfortunately, popular awareness about African history is so lacking that a mistake this egregious can slip by hundreds of thousands of people seemingly unnoticed. And that's the main reason why I felt the need to make this video instead of just leaving a comment. And here's the thing, Economics Explained cite exactly one source, which was apparently so key to their video that they refer to it in the title. MIT study reveals why Africa is still poor. On account of this, one would be excused for thinking they were drawing their arguments from this study by Darren Ajamoglu and James A. Robinson, simply entitled, Why is Africa Poor? However, I read the study, and it very definitively avoids these mistakes. There are some points I would dispute, but the researchers clearly put in the work to make historically grounded arguments, and in fact explicitly contradict the misconceptions we've talked about in the Economics Explained video. They talk about contact between the Kingdom of Aksum and Eurasia, and the transport of enslaved Africans across the Sahara, and via the Persian Gulf, into the Middle East for at least 1,000 years before the Atlantic trade started, making it clear that sub-Saharan Africa wasn't cut off like the video says. While focused on the slave trade specifically rather than trade in general, they even get into how there was more trade across the Sahara than along the Atlantic coast of Africa until the 17th century. The study further mentions farmers and agriculture in multiple Central African states, including a quote that explicitly describes the presence of local staple crops that were partly replaced by higher-yield American crops after the Columbian Exchange, which makes it pretty apparent that Central Africa had agriculture prior to this point. If Economics Explained cited any other sources, I could attribute their mistakes to them trying to reconcile contradicting claims, but since I don't, it really seems like they just filled the gaps in sloppy reading with their own preconceptions. So, while this video isn't just criticizing Economics Explained, like I said, I do have to say they should improve their research and citation standards. One more slightly smaller issue in the video is how they talk about the presence of wheels in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, unlike the previous misconceptions, this one is actually drawing from the MIT study by Darren Ajamoglu and James A. Robinson referenced in the video title. But here again they insert some of their own misconceptions to weaken what is already a pretty weak argument, in my opinion. I don't want to go over Ajamoglu and Robinson's argument, so I'll simply encourage you to check out their original study and see how well you think their argument holds up compared to my points against the Economics Explained video.
Even really simple technologies like a wheel weren't widely adopted. The cheap transportation that something this simple enables means that it becomes easier and easier for societies to develop outside of small village groups because resources can be traded between different areas, allowing people to specialise. If something like food, tools, or building materials need to be transported by head porterage, where people just put heavy things directly on top of their head, then that's way less efficient than even a basic handcart. At that point, it just becomes easier for societal groups to be self-sufficient because it's so hard to do trade. By the time Western technology made it to Africa, regions such as the Congo were loosely run by kings that would rule by decree with little to no oversight. They would raise revenues through arbitrary taxes and take things by force where they saw fit. This pushed groups that wanted to avoid the rule of these unchecked leaders further away from the basic roads that existed in the region, so instead of developing a culture of trade and interdependence, the tyrannical ruling institutions encouraged exactly the opposite. It also wasn't worth putting too much effort into making even simple stuff like a handcart when it could just be seized by some absolute monarch at their whim.
First off, let's be clear that sub-Saharan Africans were perfectly familiar with the concept of wheels before the early modern period, with plenty of technologies in the region making use of wheels in some form. From pottery wheels and water wheels in Sudan, to wheels in the loom pulley system seen throughout West Africa. So there's also no reason to think that Africans were dissuaded from producing these technologies by the fear of tyrannical kings stealing their stuff, as the video suggests. Moreover, they're still obviously working with the assumption that sub-Saharan Africa was cut off until after Atlantic trade took off, thus making it impossible for wheeled vehicles to spread to the region from Eurasia. As we've discussed, sub-Saharan Africa wasn't actually cut off at all, and historical evidence does in fact show that wheels spread across the Sahara. Ancient artwork shows that Nubians had chariots, and chariots and ox carts are seen in Saharan rock art dated to between 1350 BCE and 950 CE, from as far south as the bend of the Niger River in Mali, with it being entirely possible that they were present a bit further south as well. However, these wheeled vehicles appear to have completely disappeared at some point in the first millennium CE. This phenomenon wasn't unique to sub-Saharan Africa. Chariots also pretty much disappeared from Eurasia and North Africa during late antiquity, and use of wheeled transport like ox-drawn carts also declined significantly after this time, virtually disappearing in West Asia and North Africa in late antiquity, and becoming fairly rare in Europe from the 5th to 17th centuries. So why would this be? Well, contrary to what Economics Explained suggests in the video, there are transportation options beyond carrying things on your head and using wheeled transport, like pack animals and transportation by boat. In some cases, these have significant advantages over wheeled transport. Boats are basically all around better, generally being able to carry more weight and move faster than any person or animal with or without a wheeled cart. The trade-off is only being able to move along set routes determined by nature, but in a pre-modern world where most large settlements were built along major waterways, this was perfectly viable for a significant amount of long-distance trade, and was the preferred means of transport basically everywhere. There's a reason why shipping is our default term for transporting goods to this day. Pack animals, meanwhile, obviously can't carry as much on their backs as they could pulling wagons, but wheeled vehicles only really improve efficiency on smooth, firm terrain, easily getting stopped by roots or rocky terrain or bogged down in mud or loose sand. Pack animals, meanwhile, can much more easily overcome these kinds of obstacles. In West Asia and North Africa, the popularization of the camel saw wheeled vehicles fall out of fashion, as camels can carry large loads over uneven terrain and sand dunes without issue. In Europe, meanwhile, greater use of pack animals like donkeys corresponds to the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, when much of Rome's extensive road network fell into disrepair. Without a large hegemonic state, it was simply harder to maintain high-quality road networks with pre-modern technology. With fewer well-maintained roads, wheeled vehicles became less useful, and pack animals largely took over among merchants and the lower classes until the early modern era. These same basic factors pretty effectively explain why wheels weren't really used in sub-Saharan Africa for much of history. In Saharan rock art, the disappearance of ox carts roughly corresponds to the first appearances of camels. Further south in the forest zone, fast-growing vegetation and long rainy seasons made road systems even enough for wheeled transport difficult to maintain. Now, it's possible to maintain extensive road networks within this region, as seen in examples such as the West African Asante Empire and the East African Kingdom of Buganda, but even the rigorously maintained Asante road system was described by one visitor as turning into a continuous bog during the heavy rains of the wet season. Any increased efficiency that a simple handcart might lend over head porterage was marginal in the face of such environmental obstacles, and pack animals like donkeys could lend that same efficiency without the same drawbacks. It was simply more effective for people in this region to maintain more basic paths and rely on boat travel or pack animals for anything they couldn't just transport by hand or head porterage. We can see examples of this in Asia's Kingdom of Burma, which widely adopted wheeled transport in the 19th century without seeing any improvements in transportation relative to the Kingdom of Asante. And in the case of Lord Lugard's failed ox cart project in colonial northern Nigeria, where investment in wheeled vehicles to replace local pack animals and head porterage, without accompanying investment in road infrastructure, actually saw an increase in expenses, rather than a decrease, with the region returning to the previous practices within 4 years. As such, environmental factors provide the strongest explanation for why wheels never really took off in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, even when they were clearly known and used in certain contexts within African societies. The lack of wheels didn't stifle trade distance, and local African kingdoms did in fact see plenty of long-distance trade. And sub-Saharan Africa isn't unique in this situation. In addition to the previously mentioned Eurasian cases, the Americas also never saw wide-scale adoption of wheeled vehicles in spite of people being familiar with the concept. Pack animals and foot transport worked fine, and environmental factors made wheels a less effective option in many cases. Didn't stop them from forging large states, most notably the massive Inca Empire. At the end of the day, wheels are a very simple technology, but that doesn't mean that wheeled transport is a default state for complex societies. And yes, sub-Saharan Africa also saw plenty of occupational specialization, both in terms of regions focusing on different goods and resources, and individuals specializing in different trades. So that covers the glaring issues with this video by Economics Explained. To make this a bit more productive than just debunking stuff though, I'd like to wrap up this video with a few recommendations for further research. First, I'd highly encourage you to check out the article by Darren Ajamoglu and James A. Robinson, Why is Africa Poor? Because although I strongly disagree with some of their arguments, I think overall the arguments they make are a lot more compelling than the simplified versions featuring in the Economics Explained video, and come without the same major misconceptions that we've just spent some time debunking. I'm also going to be including a few key books to read if you're interested in diving deeper into African history. Finally, I'm going to be linking some African history-focused YouTube channels, as well as plugging a few of my own videos on African history. With that, I hope this video has done something to counter some widespread myths about African history for a few people, and maybe even encourage some of you to look more deeply into this area. Thanks for watching, everybody. I've been Soma, and I'll see you next time.